slave trade transported about 12 million Africans to the Americas. But here's the difference that matters. Of the 12 million Africans who crossed the Atlantic, their descendants number over 100 million today in the Americas. Of the 17 to 25 million Africans who entered the Arab slave trade, their descendants in the Middle East and North Africa number in the low millions at best. Where did everyone go? The answer is in what the Arab slave trade did differently, and it started with how they captured their victims. Arab and Swahili slave traders operated from bases along the East African coast: Zanzibar, Kilwa, Mombasa, Mogadishu. They worked with local African collaborators who raided villages in the interior. Entire regions were depopulated. The historian Ibn Battuta, travelling through East Africa in 1331, wrote of villages that had been abandoned for generations, the people simply gone. The caravans moved inland, sometimes 1,000 miles from the coast. They targeted specific groups: young women between 12 and 25, young men who could be castrated, children under 10 who could be converted and trained. The elderly were killed immediately. Useless for sale, useless for labour. Infants were killed because they slowed down the march. Pregnant women were killed because they were liability. The selection was brutal, efficient, and it happened in minutes. Then came the march. The journey from the African interior to the coast could take 3 to 6 months. Captives were chained in coffles, wooden yokes connecting them neck to neck in lines of 20 to 50 people. They walked barefoot across terrain that shredded feet, through tsetse-fly country, through regions with no water for days. British explorer David Livingstone encountered these caravans repeatedly during his travels in East Africa in the 1860s. He documented what he saw. In his journal entry from July 1866, he wrote, "We passed a woman tied by the neck to a tree and dead. The people of the country explained that she had been unable to keep up with the other slaves in a gang, and her master had determined that she should not become the property of anyone else if she recovered. I may remark that we saw others tied up in a similar manner." Read that again. If a woman couldn't walk fast enough, she was tied to a tree and left to die of thirst. Not killed quickly, left to die slowly so no one else could have her. Livingstone estimated that for every slave who reached the coast alive, 5 died during the march. A Swiss explorer named Johann Burckhardt, travelling in the Sudan in 1814, recorded finding a trail of corpses that stretched for miles. The path was marked by skeletons, he wrote, so numerous that they formed a continuous line. Women who collapsed were beaten. Women who begged for water were beaten. Women who helped other women were beaten. The Arab traders wanted them weak, compliant, broken by the time they reached the coast, and sexual assault started immediately, on the march, before the sale. This was standard practice. The Italian explorer Romolo Gessi, travelling in Sudan in the 1870s, documented that female captives were routinely raped by the traders and their guards during the march. Those who resisted were killed as examples to the others. By the time Wana reached Zanzibar, she had witnessed things that no human should see, and she was about to discover that the march was only the beginning. The Zanzibar slave market operated in full view of British authorities, who had signed treaties to suppress the slave trade, but did nothing to stop it. The market was held daily. At its peak in the 1860s, approximately 50,000 slaves passed through Zanzibar every year. Most of them were women. The process was identical to what happened in North African slave markets, but with one crucial difference. These women weren't being sold for domestic work in local households. They were being sold for export to the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, the Ottoman Empire, and India. Before the sale, women were taken to holding cells beneath the Anglican Cathedral, which now sits on the site of the former market. Those cells still exist. You can visit them today. They're tiny, airless stone chambers where up to 75 people were crammed together in spaces meant for 15. The women were prepared for sale. Washed, their wounds treated superficially, their bodies oiled to make their skin shine. Those who looked too sick or too defiant were beaten until they learned to appear docile. Then came the inspection. British naval officer Lieutenant Colonel Rigby, stationed in Zanzibar in 1860, documented what happened in these markets in his official reports to the British government. "I have myself seen the slave market. The mode of examination which the slaves, particularly the females, have to undergo is such as cannot be described. Young women and girls, many of them of surpassing beauty, are subjected to the most humiliating inspection." He couldn't bring himself to write the details, but other witnesses did. French naval officer Captain Guillard, who visited Zanzibar in 1856, wrote that female slaves were forced to strip completely for inspection. Buyers examined every part of their bodies. They pried open their mouths to check teeth. They felt their breasts, their thighs, their genitals. They bent them over to inspect them from behind. This wasn't hidden in private rooms. It happened in public squares, with crowds watching, with children present, with religious scholars standing nearby who saw nothing wrong with it. The women who cried were beaten into silence. The women who resisted were dragged to the whipping post and lashed until they bled. The message was clear: you are property now. You have no rights. Your body belongs to whoever pays for it. Attractive women between 15 and 25 commanded the highest prices. They were destined for harems in Arabia and the Ottoman Empire. But attractive meant something specific. Light skin was valued over dark skin. Traders deliberately sought women from certain ethnic groups known for lighter complexions. Women who were too dark sold for substantially less, often ending up in agricultural work in Oman or Yemen. This colorism within the slave trade itself created a market hierarchy where African women were literally ranked by how closely their appearance approximated Arab beauty standards. The darker you were, the less human you were considered, and the prices reflected it. A light-skinned Ethiopian or Somali girl could sell for 10 times what a darker-skinned woman from the interior would bring. Once sold, the women faced another journey, the crossing of the Indian Ocean or the Red Sea. The ships were called dhows, wooden vessels designed to carry cargo, not people. British naval patrols intercepted these dhows regularly after 1820. Their reports are preserved in British National Archives. Here's what they found. Women packed into cargo holds so tightly they couldn't lie down, chained together in the darkness, no ventilation, no sanitation, in temperatures that exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, for voyages that lasted 2 to 4 weeks. HMS Daphne intercepted a dhow off the coast of Zanzibar in 1868. The naval log records that 170 slaves were aboard a vessel designed to carry 30. They found 19 dead bodies in the hold. The women were so dehydrated their tongues were swollen and black. Several had gone mad from thirst and heat. They were sitting in their own waste, covered in sores and infections. The British freed them and took them to a mission station in Mombasa. 12 more died within 3 days. The slave traders' logic was coldly economic. A certain percentage would die during transport. That was factored into the price. Better to pack more slaves and lose 20% than pack fewer and lose profit. Women who became pregnant during the march or before the voyage were often thrown overboard mid-crossing. The British naval records document multiple instances of pregnant women found floating dead in the water near dhow routes. For women who survived the market and the crossing, the real horror began in the harems of the Middle East. Not the fantasy version of harems from Hollywood movies, the reality. Here's what you need to understand. Most harems weren't palaces. Most were middle-class households where enslaved African women did back-breaking domestic labour for families who viewed them as subhuman. They worked from before dawn until after midnight, cooking, cleaning, hauling water, tending animals, raising their owners' children. Any mistake resulted in beatings. Any resistance resulted in worse. But some women, particularly the younger and more attractive ones, ended up in wealthier households or royal courts. And for them, the horror was different. Ottoman archives contain records of African slave women in the imperial harem. They were called jariya, a word meaning both slave and concubine. The distinction didn't exist. If you were an enslaved woman in a household with adult men, you were available for sexual use. This was understood. This was legal under Islamic law of the period. No consent was required because slaves couldn't give or withhold consent. British missionary Charles Buxton, working in the Arabian Peninsula in 1888, interviewed freed slave women in Aden. Their testimonies were published in a report to the British Anti-Slavery Society. One woman, freed after 12 years in Jeddah, described being purchased at age 13 by a merchant who had 4 wives and 6 other slave concubines. She was used by both the master and his adult sons. When she became pregnant at 15, she was beaten by the first wife, who blamed her for the master's attention. She gave birth alone in a storage room. The baby was taken from her 3 days later and given to the first wife to raise. She never knew if the child was a boy or girl. So why don't we talk about this? Why does the Atlantic slave trade dominate every discussion of slavery, while the Arab slave trade, which lasted 3 times longer, and enslaved nearly as many people, barely gets mentioned. The biggest reason this history disappeared is simpler. The women who could have told these stories died. Most never made it home. Those who did were often too traumatized to speak. The few testimonies we have came from missionaries and abolitionists who interviewed freed slaves. And even those testimonies are incomplete, sanitized, reduced to a few paragraphs in reports that no one reads anymore.